welcome. First of all, James and Monica, thanks for joining us, and welcome also the people online from the different initiatives. For those of you online that don't know me, I'm Karen Macour. I'm the chair of SPIA, in my day job, a professor at the Paris School of Economics. So we are very excited to have the next session, and I let my role here is to introduce Monica, and then Monica will take it away from here. Let me just kind of set the framing here, because we got a couple of questions, not a lot, but a couple of questions of how this session fits into our event here the last few days. So we are with six, as for those of you online here, we're with 6 of the research initiatives of the new portfolio, focusing very much on the design of some of the experimental impact assessment studies. But of course, the part of the research initiatives, a number of the research initiatives, including some of those that are online, also have strong policy influence impact pathways, or potentially policy influence impact pathways, and more general kind of trying to address political, institutional, or social questions, and therefore also outcomes. And so that need different, different research questions, and therefore different tools needed to answer those. And so, while this next session is not a matchmaking, it is a discussion about some of these other ideas to get the discussion going on that, and to share thoughts. And so with that, let me just introduce Monica. So Monica is one of the panel members. Monica Biradavolu, who is the sole non-economist in our group, and an absolute expert in qualitative research, but also in the combination of between qual and quant. And so, without further ado, Monica, the floor is completely yours. And so, let me say one more thing, also to apologize to James and Monica. So unfortunately, I'll be with you in the very beginning here, but then I'll have to disappear, because there is a CGIAR system council, and one of the things I have to do as PI chair is being there. Sorry. Take away, Monica.
Thank you, Karen. Just to let people know that the session is being recorded based on requests that we received for people who cannot join and would want to watch this later. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session. Good morning from DC, good afternoon to everybody in Nairobi, and good evening to anybody who may be joining from further east. Like Karen said, I am a qualitative sociologist, and my remit in SPIA is to provide sort of overall guidance on qual approaches in the work that SPIA does, that includes impact assessments of, for lack of a better term, some of these more fuzzy outcomes around political, institutional, and social change. For this session, we are very, very pleased and honored to welcome James Garrett, and it is my pleasure to introduce him. We are going to be making this presentation together. We'll open up the floor for hopefully a good discussion, feedback, next steps. So we are also looking forward to that conversation. But let me introduce James to everyone who has agreed to come and help us out in this endeavor. He's a senior research fellow at CIAT, where he works on policies and programs at the nexus of food, agriculture, nutrition. He has degrees in political science, public policy, and applied econ. For almost 20 years before this, he worked at IFPRI, where he did work on impact evaluations for policy research, and worked at the interface of research, policy, and action. He led research programs in urban food, nutrition security, urban-rural transformation, and policy processes for food security and nutrition. He also served as a country program manager for IFPRI in Mozambique. He's currently based in Rome, where he's working with Rome-based UN agencies, IFAD, WFP, and UN Nutrition, working with these organizations on how to use knowledge, especially research in their work, and managing related impact assessments, operations evaluations, and cost effectiveness studies. So with that introduction, welcome James, and thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Monica, and thank you also to SPIA for having me at this session. I really appreciate it, and it's an opportunity to think about these issues a little bit more closely than before, or than I have in the past. So it's really interesting to be with you. I also wonder, there are some people in the room that I know, so but not everybody. So it's really also good to begin to familiarize myself with your names, but also the kinds of impact assessments that you're planning to do. I want to say that, as Monica and I considered this request, we really ended up with doing a lot of brainstorming ourselves and thinking not so much about sort of a list of methods to present to you and techniques, but really just more how to think about through these issues and how to construct an assessment that would assess political, institutional, and social outcomes. We did try to respond to your impact assessment needs in these areas, I would say. And so what we did is we knew that there was kind of a felt need. And so we went back through the background notes that you had for this workshop, as well as some other documents, and to try to get a sense of what kinds of issues you were trying to think about that you needed to do an impact assessment for, and also how you were, I think most importantly, how you were phrasing your research question, how you were phrasing the question about the assessment of impact around political, institutional, or social outcomes that you wanted to look at. You will see that we then took some of those statements and adapted them. I'm going to call them adapted excerpts to illustrate some of these ideas. I would say they're more, the statements that I put are not exactly direct quotes. I didn't want to put anybody on the spot. They're more like inspired by your background notes. It's sort of like, a made-for-TV movie that says that it's inspired by actual events, but it's not, but don't hold me accountable in the end. So so don't take these as take them more as illustrations is what we're trying to do. So the first part is I need to, yeah. So what we'll do is we'll go through sort of as we looked across your different notes, sort of some issues and also some principles about how to think about this that came out of our reading. And then we will talk about, and it's also actually implicit in sort of the discussion of issues, the methods that you might use when you're trying to use qualitative assessment or qualitative research for impact assessments. And then we want to discuss with you some ideas for next steps, but really more like what comes from you in terms of what would be useful and what would be needed, particularly from SPIA. When we look through this, we really also tried to sort of think about what in your impact assessment thinking, what would be the role of qualitative approaches, particularly in terms of examining your political, institutional, social change. And I'm going to apologize from the beginning for violating a cardinal rule of presentations, that I actually put a lot of the text onto these slides. And I hope that you'll just have to sort of bear with me as I go through that. But basically everything I'm going to say is on the slide itself. But it seems like various of your end of initiative outcomes and also the additional ideas for impact studies that some of you included really did involve political, institutional, and social changes. But it also really reflected, you often talked about changes in the behavior of external actors. In other words, these were actors that you were going to try to influence. And I think, as was recognized, because assessments of these kinds of changes take place within very complex environments that are difficult to control, at least in an evaluation sense. Usually, let's say, I'm going to go to the far most rigorous, which is if you had a randomized controlled trial, particularly, let's say, if it came from a medical sort of point of view, is that you have the same situation, and the only thing that you're changing in those situations is the intervention. And then during the period of the intervention, nothing else changes. So then you can attribute the change to that particular intervention. But as we know, is that when you're talking about changes or interventions or activities in sort of the real world, particularly if you're dealing with political institution or social changes, you're not able to have that kind of control. And in fact, what's going on is probably changing across your environment over time. So in this case, generally qualitative methods are most appropriate. Qualitative approaches can focus on detailing that narrative of change, and we'll come back to that word a lot about how you construct your narrative of change, but also how you need to support it with evidence. And at the same time, you can, of course, and I think it actually makes your evaluation stronger, if you can complement that with some quantitative methods, meaning, for example, there's a range of things, and we won't get into this, but at least not in this presentation, but you can, for example, enumerate outputs. You can survey stakeholders. You can take, like a SurveyMonkey, for example, and that can be used then to complement or confirm or deepen or enrich the narrative that you're making. The statements, the first issue that we would like to address, or sort of recommendation, is be sure to clarify the purpose of this assessment itself. The statements about your outcomes really varied in terms of purpose, which is fine, but then it also varied in terms of what kinds of methods to generate the needed answers. Not all of what we saw in the outcome statements really required an impact assessment. It's things like, we will reach 30,000 beneficiaries. We will test principles. Are we internally working well together? And things like 5 million stakeholders will adopt the package and increase production by 10%. So these are things that actually, in some cases, could just be answered by a standard monitoring system or an operations evaluation, which means, you look at the actual, how does a program actually work, or just a study. So as you think about what you want to do in terms of analyzing the impact of your initiative or initiative activities on institutional, political, social outcomes, we are trying to sort of just say, yes, you can do lots of things, but whatever you want to do, if you really mean we're going to do an impact assessment, be clear that it's an outcome that really requires an impact assessment approach. That also then helps you clarify the design of the assessment and also how those findings will be used. So clearly define the purpose of the assessment, and then also use this to shape your statement and your research question that you have for that impact assessment. For example, other purposes of an assessment might be, when you look at these statements, we wondered, for example, well, are these statements that really not impact assessment per se, but that your motivation for putting that down as an outcome that you're interested in is sort of monitoring for reporting? Or do you want to have an outcome that you're really monitoring for management? Or is it really for evaluation? So you really are trying to causally examine, did these activities result in these changes? Potentially, as I said, this could be complemented with an operations or a process evaluation study that would look at the how and why these changes happened, or are what you're trying to accomplish in terms of the statement that you put in terms of your end of initiative outcomes. Is it really just to try to promote learning about how to do things better, even in terms of your initiative management? At the same time, we wanted to know, really, as we were thinking about sort of how do you want to shape your impact assessment, really who needs this information, who wants this information, and why? How will they use it, and then how will you use it? And in that case, then you can focus in on what do you really need to measure in terms of doing your impact assessment, and what then are the most effective ways to generate and present that information to the user. The second issue that we're going to spend a little bit of time on, actually, because we feel it's important, is to be sure that you get the impact pathway and the impact focus right. a lot of the statements really were, I would say, kind of difficult to evaluate and kind of difficult to attribute to your particular initiative. Some of them were many of them were fairly aspirational, and they focused on outcomes that actually depend on various external factors and the actions of others. And we'll talk about how you can still evaluate that, but that's just an important recognition. In fact, some of the statements cited organizational changes within other organizations as a goal, which is that if I'm looking at it as an impact evaluator, I would be saying, okay, you are saying you will be responsible for making those changes within those other organizations. And I think that would probably give us pause. Sometimes they're rather grand goals, but perhaps then they back in the statement, they back off from the goal and just say, oh, but we're only going to contribute this. I think then the question is just to make sure that it's very clear about what your impact pathway is. For example, some of the things that some of the statements would say things like international agencies are making policy decisions. Indigenous leaders have increased capacity and they are working in a multi-sectoral way. The private sector is investing a certain amount of money in sustainable technologies. Country governments will use this analysis and that will lead to crop production increases. Partner organizations have management practices and structures that empower staff. So you can see where, if you're trying to talk about what you are going to be responsible, a lot of these outcome statements sort of really push that down beyond what what your organization, your initiative would actually be responsible for, and it's rather far down the pathway in terms of what you might actually want to say you are able to accomplish. It's not that you shouldn't think about what these outcomes are, but if we're trying to think about responding to your concerns about how do we evaluate our impact on these political, social, institutional outcomes, that this is something to think about to make sure that you're actually getting your impact and your impact focus correctly when you actually set up the evaluation. So that means, make sure that the institutional, political, and social changes you claim you are responsible for are actually feasible, they're reasonable, and they're ethical, and that they're tightly and clearly related to what your initiative does. As I said, I didn't read through all of the proposals, and so I only got a brief sense of what you have in mind from your background notes, but these really varied widely. In other words, there wasn't necessarily all the initiatives are doing the same thing. All the initiatives are doing research. In fact, the focus on research, except perhaps when you mentioned innovations or technology, often in these statements didn't come through so strongly. It was more about capacity building, maybe technical assistance, maybe advisory services, maybe tools, maybe supporting change leadership. But whatever it is that you're doing along this range of activities, it needs to be clear to you when you set out how you're going to do these impact assessments, how that activity, how that output, how those products that you have will then promote or encourage those institutional, political, and social changes. And one thing that I think that we want to stress is that although these are, we're talking about a qualitative approach, as with any good evaluation, you still need an underlying conceptual framework of causality and clearly defined indicators of impact that are credible and that it will actually be feasible for you to collect. And you still need to make sure that your question about impact assessment is really evaluable. I personally find it useful to combine sort of an analysis of what your impact pathway and your theory of change is with more standard log frame approaches, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. And perhaps a little bit provocative, but I really feel like also within the context of a qualitative narrative, you still should be thinking about what indicators you have, and they can still have, to some extent, characteristics of indicators that we believe are good characteristics, such as being smart, as well as accurate, reliable, feasible, useful, and ethical. Some of these are obviously more difficult in a in a qualitative context. In other words, you might be able to have an output indicator that you think would apply across political conditions, but it may be more general than, say, the construction of a quantitative index, and how difficult it would be to actually measure that, not quantitatively, but we are talking about, can you, again, tell what your narrative is, and can you provide a convincing story about what's happening? But I still think that it's useful to go back to at least these ideas as guidance for how you might think about what you want for your indicators. Tracing out that impact pathway clearly in detail in terms of your activities, the outputs, who the actors are, and the connections between each step. I think we sometimes just draw an arrow and we don't think about how does this step lead to that step. But I think that's actually very important, because where those links fail is then where the whole process fails, the chain fails. So I think that it's important to think about, what are we doing, who are we directing our activities toward, and what changes, what do we expect them to happen as a result of those activities. So in that impact pathway, it's again about constructing the narrative, your story about how you plan to have impact. Some people, I'm sort of talking about putting a narrative to change, actually. Understand who is doing what, how they interact, what factors affect them. And that also means, and I go back to this issue about what you're responsible for, and then how you plan to influence the actual achievement of those later outcomes, which is, who are your key boundary partners? That is, those you hand off your work to, and who then are responsible for taking the use and application of your work forward to impact. And what are their needs? How do you interact with them? What do you plan to do to influence them, as well as the environment that they work in that will actually lead to change? And then how do these outputs and actions flow through to the next step? Particularly, how does the direct effect of your work flow on to intended outcomes of change? So using this more detailed impact pathway, you can determine what your impacts should be, or can potentially be, reasonably be, and also your valuable questions. So first, what's the impact pathway for your specific intervention, product, work? So that's what's the pathway, and this is where I combine, as I said, theory of change with the first standard log frame, which is your pathway from inputs, activities, outputs for your product, whatever that is, to then how you expect that final political, institutional, social change, which is sort of the outcome of the impact, to actually happen. This pathway then can be at the project, work package, or initiative level. I think it's important, very important, to say, from an evaluator's perspective, what's the direct effect of your intervention? That is, as part of the impact pathway, what will happen as a direct result of your product, of your work, with what effect and on whom? So at what point in this pathway do your actions, product, have an actual impact, the direct effect for which you are fully responsible? That product is then handed off to others who are actually responsible for making these political, institutional, social changes. But who are these boundary partners? They could be government, they could be private sector actors, they could be civil society. What are the actions you hope to, or actually need to see from these boundary partners for this impact pathway to continue to function? And how will this generate those intended outcomes that you have identified in your research question, impact assessment outcomes that you plan, or the outcomes that you plan to assess? And what specifically are these outcomes in terms of those political, institutional, or social changes that you want to see, and you hope to, in some sense, attribute to your initiative? One way to think about this is using an evaluator's perspective. What can you be held accountable for? And again, go back to the statements that I took from some of your, or took as inspiration from your background notes, is actually, when you talk about what those outcomes are, what parts of the impact pathway are really under your control, particularly those direct effects. And so an evaluator could hold you responsible for them. You want to be sure that those direct effects are what you are putting up as what you want to be held accountable for. beyond direct effects, what are the outcomes to which an evaluator could reasonably say you should be able to contribute, even if I am not able to, as an evaluator, hold you specifically responsible for? Your initiative, for example, may have very little, if any, control over some outcomes. For example, if we say the private sector makes gender transformative changes, but you can be held responsible for whether you did your best to engage with those boundary partners along the rest of the impact pathway to achieve those outcomes. That is, or for example, to produce and deliver useful products effectively and support appropriate changes in the enabling environment, including targeting influential actors and having a strong communications or capacity building strategy. And I put this down there with the idea too, that you will be very specific in terms of how you trace out that impact pathway. In other words, not just say, we will have a strong communications strategy. We will build capacity. We will target influential actors. For this information to be useful for constructing the impact assessment and for understanding what the impacts that you want to be held accountable for are, you need to be as specific as possible about how that will happen, which actors to do what, communication strategy to do, doing what, to convince whom, and what kinds of capacity need to be built and how that will be done. I think that's where, if you think about, we want to have impact on political, social, institutional outcomes, you need to be very specific so that then will also help you, as we said, to construct what is your impact assessment question. And I think it will emerge much more clearly. And you should then also have, I would say, better guidance about what you need to do, but also what you are orienting the evaluator who comes in to look at. That, of course, also means that you have understood the pathway. I call it chains of actions, the actors and the factors as well. You need to be sure or specify the scale, and we call it the theme of impact. A lot of these proposals have theories of change that are stated to occur at the initiative as well as the work package, and some of them are also at the project level. And the outcomes that they talk about cover both individuals and institutions, whether it's organization or we're going to establish an institution, or policymakers and private decision makers, which is more as an individual level. So we can see individuals, institutions are coming out of this, which is also fine. Again, most of these issues that we're talking about are not particularly problems. We're just sort of providing them as principles that as you think about how do we evaluate political, social, institutional outcomes, what do we need to be sure that we're doing so that we, at the end of the day, have an evaluable action and we have an evaluable impact. So that's just to be clear when you do your impact pathway, when you think about what you want that question of impact, that statement of impact at the end of the day, what it should be looking at. Be sure that it's clarified in terms of we're looking at an individual level, we're looking at institutions, we're looking at initiative, work package, project. All of those are fine. All of those can be done, but it just would probably be a little bit clearer and more specific, if a little bit clearer and a little bit easier to carry out what you're doing, particularly in terms of how you may explain it to others, if it's clear about what the scale is and also the theme. In other words, what's the scale of the direct effect and your ended outcomes? Is the evaluation going to focus on changes due to your initiative, to this program or the project? Is it going to focus on institutional, political, or social change? In any case, the impact pathways that you specify, the direct effects and the indicators will differ. It's also important that you take into account the difference in the context. Again, I just want to emphasize, these were not meant to be, and they were not sort of criticisms of what, or that there's a particular way to do this in terms of your outcome statement. It was just that as we looked across them, we saw these sorts of issues or characteristics and wanted to highlight them as things to consider when you actually, as I said, I would say restate or refine your outcome statements, and you think about what you're doing for your political, institutional, social outcomes. We found that the statements would cut across and in fact often clumped them together. in terms of an outcome, even though you're talking about countries or regions with very different political, institutional, and social contexts, which then would then have very different outcomes that you may want to be evaluated on. Within a country, even, organizational contexts and capacities can differ, but we often found that the stated outcomes were the same. So we would say 5 companies, and WC, ESSA, and LAC used the data. Farmers in Bangladesh, Colombia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Mozambique will use the modeling data and support tools. And we know that the capacities of those farmers, we know that the capacities of the government, the capacity of the private sector, the agroecological conditions, in the technological conditions in each one of those countries is very different. So you probably do want them to be much more specific in terms of what are you really trying to evaluate for those particular country contexts where you're going to be working and where you would invite an impact assessment. So when you come up with what that outcome statement is, think about what's the context in which these actions and changes will take place. And therefore, how does that context affect your actions, your effects, and your outcomes? Because the context in which that impact pathway operates will vary. The institutional structures, and even, I talk about the capacities there, but really it's also even the institutional structures, the decision-making processes, the political processes, the resources and the individual, institutional, and systemic capacities, the social mores, the relevance of the private sector, all vary. And they would then affect how you want to actually state your outcome statement. And therefore, as I said, invite an impact assessment of what you're doing. So the context in which you work will change those actions, those direct effects and the outcomes, and your theories of change and impact pathways will also look different across those contexts. The 5th issue we came up with is something that I think we're all struggling with, and is probably a little bit nerve-wracking for all of us, and that's the timing. We did find that there were a number of the outcome statements that were nicely and clearly stated as short-term, or what we can achieve by 2024, and that really seems like a good idea. Others of the statements were likely to be achieved only after the end of the initiative, and I guess my recommendation is to try to make this as reasonable and feasible in terms of those outcome statements as possible. Under promise, I think, and over deliver is probably a good rule here. Some of them have grand goals, and I think that's another possibility. Say this is where we would like to end up if we had 5-10 years, but we can, at this point, we're only focusing on our particular contribution to the initiative. It does say, for example, you could say something like, in the long term, we expect to contribute to food system thinking applied across the whole government. But in the short term, we're just going to take the first step and build awareness by policymakers. So again, when we're thinking about these changes that are political, social, and institutional, we know that takes a long time, and we know that the contexts are different, and we know that you're not in full control of that process. So timing is also related to the fact of how quickly those processes take place. And SPIA may have more to say about this, but my feeling, also working on some of these initiatives, is that even if you're reporting your impacts at the end of year 3, when all of these are supposed to end, you only have about 2 years from now to have the change that you will measure, if not less, because you need to start the evaluation even some months before the project ends. Unfortunately, this is also not optimal, since the information you obtain at the end of the initiative, even under this scenario, it can be relevant for reporting, but it's not particularly useful for management or immediately applicable operational insights. Now, Monica will talk about methods that can help address this issue, but it's just something that I think it's important to take into account when you make your outcome statements. So therefore, what changes are realistically possible within the time frame of the project? As I mentioned, political, institutional, social change can be slow. It doesn't happen linearly. There are multiple change processes and multiple actors happening at the same time. And even we know within the implementation of the initiative itself, and I think we're all experiencing this, there are jags and lags in how we interact with the funders, the donors, the demands from the system itself that will affect what you can and cannot do, or how quickly you can do it. So be reasonable and be realistic in terms of how you think about what your outcomes are. So be clear on how much time it will take to see the effects of your work and for these changes to work through the impact pathways to outcomes. Again, that's why it's so important to trace out what you think those impact pathways are, what those activities are, and then apply a reasonable time frame to them. And then look at what those changes are, and that's what we would focus on in terms of what your indicators are. What can we really realistically expect in terms of our particular contribution in this time frame towards those perhaps longer term institutional, political, social changes? I found, and I don't know, I assume that most of you have been with the CG at least a few years. I found that the CRP outcome and impact case report templates were actually useful. They recognized the process and the time it took for innovations to actually reach impact. And the stages they had there, if you remember, were, first was their discourse even, and Monica will talk about this. But one of the things is you're generating products, you're generating whatever your innovations are. Are you at least getting it into the conversation? The policy making agenda, the social change agenda, the institutional change agenda. So that's the first thing, is are you seeing changes in discourse around this innovation? Then might you see behavior changes? And those are direct effects. You are responsible for whether that discourse gets into the conversation or not, and whether your topic gets on the agenda. Then you could talk about, are those end users actually showing any kinds of changes in policies or practice? And that would be more your intermediate or perhaps final outcome. And then larger is adoption and impact at scale, which is sort of the final outcome and the impact. And this will take years, and we know that. But that's not, the point is to take that into account and not feel like you have to already get to final outcome and impact, and that's what you're evaluating. You may want to put it into your impact pathway so you understand how you're contributing to get there, but that's not the indicator that you are asking to be evaluated on when you think about these changes. The sixth issue is something that may often get overlooked, but we think is important, is that the CGIAR has a mandate to produce global public goods. So global and public are really key there. The proposals have certainly that you've written have had to describe how the initiatives are filling those global gaps in technologies and information. And your outcome statements made clear how the initiatives must work with a variety of partners to produce those goods, and then also to have those goods adopted by the right users. Sometimes those partners are not particularly clear, but are left kind of vague. And clarity is needed to understand whose behavior needs to change to achieve your expected outcome and how you expect to achieve that. Sometimes these partners that we're talking about were left really just as categories. Researchers, policymakers, development practitioners, and they tended to be sometimes sort of all clumped together, not necessarily clarifying what change do you really want to see from each one of these, how will you help that to happen, what are you delivering to them? You have, for example, food companies, seed companies, private sector firms use the analyses to establish, let's say, standards and analyses for marketing. Women and youth are prioritized, vulnerable partners and smallholders acquire capacities. So you can see that that's fine, but what we're encouraging is that when you think about these political, social, institutional changes, what behaviors do you really want to see in very specific, in the behaviors of their very specific partners? And we do consider them partners as well as beneficiaries of the information. when we think about those actions, so our contributions, and I'm going to say underlined by the actions and the impact pathways, should reflect CGIAR's goals and roles as an international public organization and should bear ethical principles in mind. So how does this come to play in terms of whether you're doing your impact assessment or what it is that you're doing? Because we would argue that the direct effects and the outcomes and our statements of them should take those ethical principles into account. So we would ask, no matter who your partner is, whether it's civil society or government or the private sector, does the work remain public oriented? You know, we're not a private sector consulting firm. We are not necessarily an implementer and policy and political activist. We're not working specifically inside an organization to help them, but whatever we do, we're trying to make sure that our work contributes to public change in public policies and programs and benefits then the livelihoods of people that we have in mind as our target beneficiaries. So are we monitoring them to ensure that we are filling the gaps that we've identified in an ethical way? Are our actions and the resources we bring adding value to the country, especially to the livelihoods of smallholders and other marginalized groups? Are we crowding in and not crowding out national and regional capacities? Are we working to build in-country capacities needed to do this work? Are the actions inclusive, recognizing and respecting all groups, especially ones that are traditionally marginalized and disempowered? And do the statements about activities, direct effects, and outcomes reflect the appropriate role of the CGIAR? So you may not have necessarily thought about this in terms of when you think about this outcome statements that you're making for your impact assessment. But for example, and this is something that was brought home to me when I was doing policy work on the policy, the impact of policy change, your policy researchers on the impact of policy research on policy change in a country. That really, it's not the center who should be able to claim responsibility for forcing the change. It's the people of the country that are responsible for that change, not the CGIAR. The CGIAR can produce the technologies and information to inform change and ensure that that information contributes to the policy process. But it's an awkward, if not actually appropriate statement when, and I realize, you know, donors can be pressing really hard to say, did you have impact? Did you make that change? And the tendency is for us to say, yes, we talked with the government of X and we're responsible for that change. And if you think about it, we're saying we, an external organization to the country, to this whole policy process, to the policy, the political agenda, the political, I would say, environment. We are claiming that we had the power to be able to make another country do a specific thing. It's not that you can't talk about how do we contribute to that, what the influence is. There's a lot around that, particularly in terms of contribution analysis, attribution analysis. But I think we have to be very careful about this way that we state the impacts that we have and what our role is in terms of contributing to that. And now I'll turn it over to Monica to talk a little bit more about what kinds of methods you might be able to use to assess these changes.
Thank you, James. So thank you for providing this, the principles that should guide such impact assessments. I'm going to be talking more about the little bit of the nitty-gritty examples that I have come across in some of the work that I have done, so that we can maybe wrap our arms around and have a discussion around whether those are feasible or not and how we should think about it. So typically what happens is, in the last 6 months of your initiative or your intervention, you call in an external evaluator to do this kind of an assessment. So taking that as a jumping off point, I am talking about how you can help such an evaluator do their work, better, I suppose, having been in the shoes of such an evaluator. So one thought is to, of course, build the evidence base as you progress. You do not have to wait until the end that someone comes in and not only has to learn about everything that you have done, but then also figure out what questions to ask, figure out, okay, making sense of all the documents that you have collected over a 2-year period, or all the effort and all the work that you have done. And in many of these non-IE type of evaluations, you might start at your effect, and then you work yourself backwards from that point to see how you arrived. What we are kind of suggesting, it's recommending, is instead maybe think of being guided by the effect outcome that you're working towards, and not wait until the very end that, okay, now is the time for this evaluation to begin. So what that will do is it'll help the evaluator develop the narrative on the foundations of a solid evidence base. And when the evaluator comes in, who is external, oftentimes, and that is also recommended, can be more strategic in filling the gaps rather than having to start from scratch. One of the questions that often comes up, and sometimes it's posed as a critique, so basically you're bringing in an external evaluator because they're supposed to be more objective. But then if you're feeding them all the data, how is this objective? Well, my response to that is twofold. One is that the evaluator still has to judge whether or not the evidence is reliable, whether it's valid, whether it's been collected well, and all of this. So it's not that you're just feeding and the evaluator should just take it all in, just because it's not God's word here. So you still put on your skeptical hat and look at the data objectively. And quite frankly, realistically, what happens is that it's not, or even if it's construed as objective, oftentimes you are anyway giving the evaluator a lot of the documents and so on. So I have been in a position where I've literally been, there's a data dump of like close to 1,000 documents. Now figure this out in 3 months and write a report. It's just, it's really can be a waste of everybody's time, because that's not feasible. So what can you do? So just as you think of doing a baseline in any of your experimental designs, even if it's a qualitative study, you can still do a baseline of what the initial situation was in terms of your indicators. So building off of what James said on figuring out, so this is assuming, now you've figured out your impact pathway, you've figured out what is your direct effect, what you are responsible for, figuring out what the indicators for those direct effects are, and doing it ahead, like doing it now, and then saying, okay, let's set up a baseline for these indicators. Where are we at? Kind of a question. So bottom line, don't wait until year 3. You have a theory of change. You have these impact pathways. You have your direct effects for developing these questions at baseline. You systematically keep track of these actions, these efforts that you're making during the course of your intervention or initiative, and you follow up at the end again. So that would be sort of your end line. And that is what you hand off to the evaluator who's coming more or less at the end line. And the evaluator can then fill in whatever gaps that maybe that he or she will see. Next slide, James. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a sort of an example of a baseline end line, not taking any particular, using basic principles of what this may look like. So again, the baseline is you're trying to understand the current status. Where are we at right now in terms of your innovation, your knowledge, your tool, your guide, or whatever it is that you're trying to implement? You could conduct focus group discussions. You could conduct internet surveys. You could conduct in-depth interviews at the beginning with these stakeholders, with these, as James nicely put it, with the boundary partners or whoever it is who you expect to influence. And that will already come up once you have your very specific pathways with the direct effects. Now, once you have used, once you have outlined like what is this pathway looking like, you then have to design these indicators. You have to develop questions. And sometimes the questions are too too high. So come down, make it more specific. If you say, I'm going to support researchers, define what do you mean by support? Just by doing that, by putting down these questions already makes it very clear to yourself, to the evaluator, what it is you're trying to do. And of course, as again was already mentioned, now if you're working with multiple stakeholders, you're working in multiple countries, you have to be strategic. You cannot do everything everywhere. You have multiple countries, you have researchers, policymakers, civil society. So you have to be strategic in selecting, okay, which country, which stakeholder are you going to be able to assess? What is evaluable in your entire institutional, social, political change that you want to see? And that made me also think that, one thing you could do is, as you start thinking about this, you could design a comparative case study that will just emerge from even answering those questions about which country, which stakeholder, and so on. And of course, I just generally say this for anything and everything, whatever you do, document strategy. And that documentation is really your qualitative methods. I mean, there is no toolbox that is out there in terms of this is, you need to explain logically, reasonably, feasibly what it is you're doing, why you're making certain selections. That is the foundation of a good methodology. And then if you were to repeat the same research, whether it is internet surveys, whether you decided to focus group discussions or in there, whatever the actual method, you repeat that at the end, and then you see the changes, and you see that when we talk about these changes, what do you expect to see, right? So if you're saying that you expect the discourse to be at X, at the beginning, you will be able to track, well, did it change at the end when you do these surveys again? So that's just one example that you can operationalize in terms of measuring these types of changes. Now, if you do find that that even in the baseline, you're finding something that is influencing or changing your initiative design, because you're learning things that you didn't know before. Now, even that is an example of, let's say you have used principles of learning by doing. You're not stuck. I hope that you don't feel that you're stuck. Your baseline has told you something, now I'm stuck with this. If you do change it, now these are what might be called traces or fingerprints to show that you were adaptable, that you were doing learning by doing, which I hear a lot about. Now, again, important to mention that this evidence is in isolation. It's probably not sufficient for you to be able to demonstrate change, but I'm just giving this to you as an example of what evidence base might look like. One important part that you hand over to the evaluator, okay, we did this thing already, here you take this in and use it in the overall end of initiative evaluation. Next slide, please. I also think that evaluators spend a lot of time at the end of the intervention to gather all this data from the enormous trove of documents that you get, simply to construct a timeline of change. Now, the other word that I have heard more recently, a lot of folks talking about, I'm not sure whether in the CG system, but certainly outside of it, World Bank and the UN agencies, about journey map. To me, journey map is nothing much more different than what we would otherwise maybe even call a simple timeline. So a forward-looking study, like when you think about it, what you're doing now and going forward is you gather the evidence systematically as the intervention unfolds. Again, this can be as simple as set up a folder. You have 24 months remaining. There may be a folder for each of those 24 months, and you then start putting in what discussions you had, what meetings you had, what workshops, conferences you may have had, and put it into those folders. So rather than giving the evaluator, again, a trove, a data dump, you have already organized it, and this is a simple trick to do to construct your own timeline. Another thing to do is to have, let's say, contemporaneous notes from discussions, meetings, workshops, conferences. And contemporaneous notes are good because they really do count as good evidence, so you don't have a problem of recall. So now what happens is at the end, you then have to start doing these key informant interviews, and you're asking people, what did you think when you were 2 years ago? And what do you think now? And you're expecting them to remember all these changes. And it may have been a very seamless kind of change that they may not remember. you'd have to push them, then how to probe. So all these issues come in. What may work better is if you have, let's say, a template of indicators that you are tracking, and you don't have to make it too onerous for yourselves, but at least if you do this, you may be able to see, all right, this is how the change actually occurred in discourse or in, let's say, agenda. If you have weekly, let's say your monthly meetings, and you have an agenda, what the language that you're using in the agenda might be another evidence point. Again, these are all ways to build an evidence mountain, let's say. So to track that change in discourse, you may just be putting in the agenda items and seeing how that language is changing. Maybe you're getting the people to start talking about what it is you want them to talk about, whether it's, nutrition sensitive, let's say. I mean, what does that mean? So now people are discussing it. So those are ways of tracking. If you want to influence farmers, I mean, I've seen use of farmer diaries. It's a slightly more, it can be a little bit onerous, but you can think about ways of having farmers do this and work with somebody who has done this before, who can advise you on how to create these diaries. And of course, always keep track, again, of your reports, briefs, anything that you have produced. These can be included in those folders to produce the timeline. And you could end up with multiple of such journey maps for different parts of your intervention. Let's say you're working with researchers in Mali. That's one journey map, which looks different from the journey map that you may have with policymakers in Nepal. So they're all different, and each journey is different. You'll learn a lot from it, and maybe it's a good way of also reporting on the changes that you are seeing. Again, I need to highlight that any such evidence in isolation is probably not sufficient to demonstrate change, but this is all part of building that evidence base from the get-go and carrying it through. Next slide. And broadly, I want to end here because the idea right now is to provide some basic principles and provide some basic foundational guidance in terms of these methods. Now, there are very many different approaches to how you build this narrative. You could be doing contribution analysis, you could be doing process tracing, there's most significant change, there's outcome mapping, and there are others. And so then you may be wondering, okay, which one should I pick? Which one should I choose? Now that's slightly a different conversation, and they're different in terms of how they understand issues of, for example, causality. I think process tracing, my understanding of it is it takes it more seriously, if you will, or makes, well, let's say it makes claims to be doing causal analysis, whereas contribution analysis is trying to ensure that you can attribute your you can create a contribution story that it's reasonable. A reasonable person reading this will be able to say, yes, your initiative contributed to this outcome. But what we want to talk about here is that regardless of these approaches, the tools in the toolkit, if you're using qualitative evaluation, in the end, they remain the same. That is, you need to do focus groups or in-depth interviews or keep notes or do observations and keep contemporaneous notes, or you have documents that you can look at. You can look at briefs, monitor reports, policy papers, YouTube videos, or whatever. So foundationally, what is important are these principles. You have to think through, regardless of what method you use or what approach you use, it's important to think about some of these things, which I'm going to highlight now. You have to think about how you sample respondent, right? So, of course, if you're doing an intervention, in the same way, it's different when you do a quant study than when you do a qual study. With qual, I basically say, make sure that you're thinking about those people who are at different levels of your effect, right? So there are some people who are attending your meetings all the time, and they are being influenced more, but there may be others who are further away who may not be as affected, or maybe they are because there is some kind of a diffusion going on. But if you have such a sample of respondents, of those closest to the intervention, those who are a little bit further away, and then you can think of little concentric circles going out, make sure you have that kind of sampling so that you can say that you did not only include those, it's a biased sample, like you only included those who are most likely to be influenced or affected. And when you use the theory of change, when you use the impact pathways, you should define the terms, be attuned to context. I think it's already been said. The next 2 points, triangulation and saturation, are two that I hold on to in doing analyses and doing, for example, sampling also. Are you getting triangulation? So if you are looking at it's like the analogy of the elephant, right? So everybody's touching a different part of the elephant. So to bring people who are touching the different parts of the elephant. And so if you're hearing the same things in terms of the discourse from these different people who may or may not be interacting that much, I think you build a stronger story, you build a stronger contribution story, you build a stronger narrative in terms of your impact. And saturation is simply, are you now hearing the same thing over and over again? The question is generally asked, how many interviews should I do? There is no, quant sampling is very different from qual sampling. I say you do as many interviews where you just now start hearing the same thing over and over again once you've done the triangulation. So if, depending on those concentric circles, the same story should be resonating. That's when you feel, I call it quits here. And I work with different projects on what that might look like, but that's the basic principle. And attribution, of course, is very important. Now, again, as was already mentioned, you already know all this. Many actors are participating in these efforts. There are many factors, it's complex. So change cannot be attributed to only one organization or initiative. So you have to be careful. What are you teasing out that is your contribution? And ethics, of course, or what an external agency can and should do in terms of influence is really important. And last but not least, recognizing the work of others and your partners, of course, is very, very key in any contribution story. So I will end there. And I think the next slide is about opening up and talking about some next steps. Just to put them all as questions, because we want to open up the floor, both for questions and ask the participants, like, how can SPIA help? And these are some ideas we've just thrown out there. Can there be a community of practice around, doing these kinds of assessments, or when you're looking at institutional, political, social outcomes? Should there be resources uploaded onto the SPIA website that you can refer to? Should we have a speaker series where we bring in people who do this kind of work and they can present their findings? Should there be a guidance document? So these are just questions now that we want to open up, and we welcome questions, feedback, discussion points. And we'll end here, open it up. Sounds good, James?
Yes. Should I leave the presentation up for now, just in case people want to refer back to? Okay. All right. I have just two little thoughts that very specific that I might want to add to that. Is that one, I didn't want to get lost. I'll go back to the very first slide that I put, is that I think it's important that that when you think about this, that you get the question for impact assessment right. That was really the point I was trying to make, I guess, at the first part, was that a lot of the a lot of the outcome statements were not necessarily impact assessment questions. They were questions that could have been answered with other methods. So as we sort of dug deeper into this, I think you'll see, and you can probably think about in a different way about what are you doing and what are the impacts that you're expected to have and that you want to have, and that you therefore want, in a sense, will want to be held accountable for. The other thing is, I think that Monica's pointed out, sampling individuals is important. Also think about, and I don't know, she mentioned it, and I don't know to what extent you have control over this, but also sampling of cases. As she said, we work in a lot of different countries. I don't know to what extent you would have, the control over, because we're talking about an external evaluation, and that may be something that an external advisor, but at least you would be able to have that conversation, is a sampling of those cases. Again, there are different ways to think about this. And Monica, please step in on this. But my feeling is, for example, if you were doing sampling for evaluation, then to some extent you want to, no, I would say, if you're doing sampling for an evaluation of, let's say, your initiative or whatever your activity, whatever your project program work package, I would argue that that needs to be done. These will almost always be purposeful samples. These are not random. But if you're looking at evaluation, you would want to do as much as possible, think through, is this representative of our issues? Okay, that's different if you're doing a qualitative study where you're doing learning, okay? Because in learning, I might want to take a purposeful sample, which is representing extremes, for example. I want to take really good, I want to take really bad, but because I want to learn from that, or I want to take a unique case, so I take an N of 1, But in this case, we're talking about evaluation. So you should be having the conversation is that my sample of cases anyway is representative of what I do. Obviously, there's some other considerations that go into that if you also want to combine learning. But essentially, I think that that just as you have to think about, and it's a little bit different to think about how I'm sampling individuals or who my respondents are, you also have to be careful in terms of to produce a credible evaluation result anyway, that you were thinking about your sampling of cases.
Yes. Yeah, all good points. And I agree about the purposeful sampling for evaluation. So what we are not sure, is there anybody on the, it's kind of hard being the chair when some people are in a room.
There are a couple of questions, John and then Sri.
Okay.
And Nielsen.
Thank you.
I see one in the chat box too.
Shall I go?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you. John Helene, co-lead of Climber. I'm a great fan of Pink Floyd, and it's as though I've just listened to Pink Floyd's greatest hits, which both inspires me and sometimes with Pink Floyd also depresses me. I absolutely buy into everything you've said. Where I think SPIA can help is that I think from the word go, we have set ourselves a more monumental task than we should have done. I've been very critical from the word go that we never developed proper theories of change in our proposals. They were extremely curtailed, and narrative was basically used to fit into a figure. And I felt at the time that that was going to come back to haunt us, and I still live with that. The other thing, James, it was very interesting. You were talking about responsible and boundary partners. As someone who grew up with ODA, DFID, and logical frameworks, I could never understand in this proposal process why we were being asked to talk about end of initiative outcomes, when, as you pointed out, outcomes are beyond the control of the researchers. So it seemed as though it was a bit of a contradiction in terms. How can we be held responsible for outcomes which are the result of the activities of actors in that sphere of influence and even the sphere of interest? Where I think tremendous help would come would be what we're trying to do in our initiative, which is to expand on that theory of change, because I can't see how we can do a proper impact assessment until we have a comprehensive theory of change, which is more than 500 words. And the other thing that the CG was promising a year ago was that initiative theories of change would be nested in broader theories of change. And that's never happened. And when I look at an initiative level, and how to go about impact assessment, either with qualitative or with quantitative tools, I really feel that we need that nesting exercise so that we're in a position to develop a comprehensive theory of change, which looks at how it meshes with the theories of change of other initiatives. So the joy is that you've highlighted what have been my concerns and others' concerns for the last year. The slight depressing thing is that I still think we've got a long way to go before we're in a position to do comprehensive impact assessments. But in terms of next steps, my biggest next step would be I would love to work with both of you and others to basically righten what I think was a wrong, and that is that our theories of change were minimalist and flawed. And once we can get theory of change right, that helps us tremendously. Thank you.
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the speakers, and it's really interesting to see different type of methods and to handle. I'm just echoing what my previous speaker was making this point regarding the theory of change at the initiatives level. You know, we have this theory of changes by work package. For example, seed equal. I work in seed equal initiative, and the seed equal, we have six work packages. We do have a very complex theory of change within a work package, but when we start developing the theory of change at the initiative levels, it becomes so complex, in fact, and I'm still struggling to fit in those the digital platform to get the theory of change. And second thing, I just like to hear more on the political side. I mean, you talked about broadly, but I still not getting clearly how you are actually measuring on the political aspects. I mean, in our case, in the seed system, that we are focusing more on public-private partnerships issues, and I'm always getting struggled. You know, it's a process, complete process, before you hit the final, the PPP, and during that process, we end up with a lot of challenges, and I don't know how it fits into this, the whole complex measure of the institutional measures and etc. So yeah, thank you.
James and Monica, you want to react now or to take another question and then react to the three?
James?
I think it's useful to respond now, at least.
Yeah,
to a few of these. Monica, do you want to?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, I'm glad that, I know it was a long presentation. It was really dense, but I'm glad that it was provocative in a way, hopefully, and hopefully useful. And I'm glad to hear what John said. I think that there are sort of two things, is that, yeah, hopefully, I don't know. I mean, I've been with the CG for a long time, and I don't know actually that much about even what SPIA does. So that's on you, Ricardo, sorry. But if it's available, you know, if it can be developed so that it helps these different initiatives really think through these impact assessments and what they're doing, I think I would think that would be great. I did wonder, I mean, when I started looking at this, I mean, to be honest, I looked at these questions, and I also wondered, John, and you kind of informed me about that now a little bit. I told Monica, I said, what are we supposed to be helping these people do? You know, it's like, are these just things that they put into their box? Because I know all of you were under tons of pressure in a very limited amount of time to answer to these things, and there was changing instructions at the same time. And you had a box and a word limit. And I did say, you know, because I told Monica, I said, I'm worried, and you said it exactly like this, John, is that I said, I'm worried that they sort of put themselves into a box because they have made these statements about outcomes way down the road that they may have been sort of feeling pressured to do. But at the same time, it's not clear to me, and I'll say this again, that these are structured as impact assessment outcomes, you know, specifically. And I think that if there's any way to use this future process, as you say, to that they're supposed to nest your initiative theory of change. If there's any way to use that process to, as you said, to go back in a way and really do that properly and say, what can we even reasonably accomplish within, say, a 2-year time period? Let's look at that and how do we evaluate that? And I do think that that's a very important conversation to have. And I think it's important, and it answers a little bit the second question, but I'll get into that a bit more, is that when you look at your theory of change and you put your timeline on it, you may very well think it's extraordinarily complicated, and it is, but it's also manageable. You know, as Monica said, take it down a level to what you can actually do and what you will actually be doing and accountable for. I think the work that you're all doing is incredibly important. I think that it just needs to be put into that kind of impact pathway with what are your direct effects and your outcomes, and therefore very clear about, yes, this is a long-term process. Yes, we will make a significant impact over time. And right now we're at, stage 1. And this is what we can accomplish. And I don't know if this is the role of SPIA, but I don't know else who would be able to take it on. But I can say that when I began doing some of this work at IFPRI on the impact of policy research on policy making, we were under a lot of pressure at the time to show that we had impact and to show that we were responsible for those changes. And they wanted, at the time, they wanted to know how many undernourished children did we save? And it was really only going through the process with internally and with outside experts and also with some of the donors themselves that it became clear that that is not what that's not the whole story. And that's why I really focused on this presentation on what's your direct effect and therefore what you can be held accountable for. But I think that whole story, how you construct that narrative, how we're a contributor, how we're one of many actors, although important, is also a discussion that I think has to be had with the people who are driving this from the top. And that's why we also put that statement in there about who's driving this and what's their motivation and what do they want out of it really, and how are they going to use this really? Because it would be a shame. I think there's a lot that you can learn, and there's a lot of reason for doing impact assessments in this way, to look at the political, institutional, social changes. But it would be a shame if you're forced to do all these things, and these are sort of time-wasting efforts, or they're ultimately seen as tick boxes, and they're ultimately seen as wasting time efforts in the sense that you do all of this good work and it gets to be in a monitoring report and it goes back up to the system and then it disappears. So again, we really want to at least make these efforts that they're reasonable, that they're feasible, and that they're also useful, even for you, or especially for you, even if maybe those that you report to ultimately don't use it. But hopefully there is a way, and again, I'll refer it back to Ricardo or to Karen. It's like, how can SPIA lead in terms of holding these discussions with those who are driving this change? And frankly, I don't know exactly who it is, but so that they understand what can be expected to come out of these impact assessments and how will they use that information. I think that was the discussion that we failed to have with the donors back at IFPRI, but we ultimately ended up doing a series of case studies, and frankly, the topic kind of slid off of the agenda. I mean, once they kind of got some of their case studies and they saw we were working on impact, it ceased to be such an important issue for them. So I'm not saying that will happen again, and I'm not sure if that's even a good outcome. But I think what would have been important is that if we had this kind of a discussion with the donors or whoever is driving the change in the system or the requirements, so that they also understand how we're thinking about this. And I think that would be useful for them. It's a process of education, I think. So,
yeah.
Niels?
Or do you want to first ask? Do you want to first ask somebody online to mix? Because there was
Oh,
some question
okay.
also online. So.
Yeah, maybe let's invite the people who are writing in the chat. Noreen, would you like to come in? And
Sure. Thanks so much. Thanks for these presentations. There are so many things that made sense, and it was helpful to concretize some of the things. I think you understand the constraints, so I'm not even sure I need to go into details here, but like you said, we were under great time pressure. We had to kind of promise the world because we were competing for resources amongst each other, which was in itself not ideal. So, you know, at this point, I'm wondering what we can do. I mean, it makes complete sense to me to bring down expectations. How do we do that when we've already promised things in our proposal? How I just anyone who knows me knows that I'm pretty cynical, but you know, it was obvious to us that it's really hard to measure our specific contribution. Donors don't care, I think, if a bunch of people in a room have a conversation about a paper we wrote or something like that. This is an extreme example, but they want to know we affected the nutrition of this many people, which is kind of stupid. But that's what they have to justify their funding for. So in this sense, I'm just not sure what we can do. What can SPIA do? I have no idea, unless you can convince donors that we need to revise down their expectations. Yeah, I really like to hear what you guys have to say and what others in the room and leading initiatives and such have to say. The structure of this was very strange, as everyone knows. There was no external evaluation built in. We all have this part of our initiatives called MELIA. We're supposed to evaluate ourselves, which is always good, right? So I'm keen to hear people's thoughts. This is where I'm personally stuck. Over.
they want to react first. They want to respond.
Did you guys hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thanks, Noreen.
Oh, okay. I got worried about the dead silence.
Sorry, what was your name again? I didn't catch some of these names.
Oh, Noreen Karachiwala. I'm at IFPRI and I work on the National Policies and Strategies Initiative.
Okay.
Rashid also has a question. I see it in the chat. So Rashid,
Rashid.
want to come in?
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. Super interesting. So one first question is, I hear an important tension between, on one side, the need for something close to a causal claim that says we had some influence in at least the policy discourse, and maybe that down the road influenced some of the decisions, policy decisions that were taken. But on the other side, the need to, one, be realistic about one's role as only a provider of a global public good, of information, of some tools eventually, but not someone that takes the decisions, and only one in the middle of plenty of other NGOs, international organizations that also tend to have this kind of influence and can provide free information. So one of the, what I'm wondering is one of the ways out of this dilemma narrowing the claim, in the sense that if to take an example, if we want to influence gender attitudes towards gender equality, etc., and we can say down the road, look at this, the government is now saying making more claims that are pro-gender equality. It's yes, but obviously you're not the only one that is promoting this kind of attitude. And as opposed to
Yeah.
within this realm of gender attitudes, we have a niche where we are contributing, we're providing more information, we're providing more ways of doing agriculture in a way that helps women contribute more and having a greater role. But this is a much sort of, as Monica was saying, we need to narrow the question. Is that also one way? I'm also thinking of it in the sort of in process tracing from the little bit that I'm trying to understand. There is this Bayesian logic, this sort of if we are the only one promoting a message and we see this message popping up now in public discourse, in the interviews, in documents, it's much stronger than if we are plenty of people promoting this message and then it shows up, because we, by Bayesian inference, it seems like we're the only one that could have been behind this. And that is only possible if we narrow the message. Is that a good way of thinking about this if we want to reach this fine balance between having a real contribution, but while being respectful, we can have a real contribution if it's narrow enough that we are the ones that are really pushing, leading this field? The sub question. I have other questions, but I think this is already.
Monica,
enough.
do you want to go first?
So yes, so broadly, I want to say a couple of things from my perspective. So I see my role here as helping moderate the discussion. I'm fairly new in SPIA. I'm also learning a lot about the CG system. So the idea here is to really hear all these concerns. And like James, I also don't know who these forces are who need to be convinced to just be reasonable and frankly not ask for the sun and the moon. It's impossible. We're living in a fool's world. And what SPIA can do is something that certainly I will have to speak with Karen and others to see, sorry, I just got a little sidetracked by Fred's comment, but I'll come back to that. So to Rashid's point, the only thing I will say, one danger in narrowing it down so much is that, let's say that the way that you are phrasing your gender messages are not being taken up in exactly that way. So the trace is not an exact match, let's say. That then puts the initiative or the program or the intervention at a disservice, because something has changed, but you haven't been able to show this exact, beautiful causal pathway that will convince somebody one-on-one, like, okay, they have taken this and copy pasted into our thing, and now I can show you. So that we have to allow for the possibilities, I think, of different ways in which these pathways work. That's why thinking through what the direct effect may be is an important first step. I'll leave it there for now as I read Fred's comment, and James, please add.
I'm actually gonna, when I finish this initial comment, I want to try to skip through the questions. I think they're coalescing around some concerns. I want to be very clear that I am not saying that you cannot identify your contribution and that it's somehow only provision of information. The whole point of doing the impact pathway is to understand, what are you doing? What are you producing? Who are your boundary partners? Who else are you working with? And then, yes, you can do a contribution analysis. I mean, when you look back, there was a whole series of the impact assessments that we did at IFPRI back in 20 years ago, where we laid out a lot of these, where we laid out the particular description of how policy change happened and what the role of information as well as advising from IFPRI was. And we came up with an additional paper that came up with what are good practices to be able to talk about what your impact influence was, what your impact was. So I'm not saying you just leave the information and that's it. And not at all. It's helping you to understand, what does that impact pathway look like? What should you be doing to be able to make sure that the information, which is basically our largest role, is to provide the research and the findings. How will that enter into the whole policy process? And yes, you may be a particular voice, but I don't think the answer is somehow we squeeze down the question. The issue, and this is what Monica and I have tried to do, is that you spell out how you plan to have influence with the information that you're providing. And I'm assuming that you got those initiatives funded because you said you were going to address a particular knowledge gap. You're addressing a particular technology gap. So maybe, yes, there are others in the room, but hopefully your initiatives have identified that you are a particularly, and this is true, a particularly strong and influential and important organization, producing particularly important knowledge, technologies, innovation. So I'm not particularly worried, if this process has been done well, that you won't be able to say, we were an important player.
Made a difference, yeah.
But then the question is, how do you assess that? How do you tell that story? And that's what we're talking about here. I do think that, and I don't think that there's a huge difference in terms of the qualitative methods that we're talking about. Obviously, between whether you're talking about an external evaluation of the initiative or your internal ones. I think that you're still talking about what does your impact pathway look for whatever level you're talking about, and the techniques are the same. Again, I would get back to, are you able to talk to whoever's driving these changes? I do think that they care two things. I think they do care about causality because they're asking you to show impact. They're asking you to say, what did you cause to happen? And then the question is to help them to understand that what you are contributing, and I realize this is part of that conversation, you are parts of an international research network that is generating cutting edge global knowledge goods. So the issue is that how can you show them, and this is what they are funding. They're funding the knowledge that undergirds the evidence that will undergird those particular decisions and those particular technologies. And I think that's what they have to, that's the conversation that we have to help them to understand, that we're willing to, say, how do we convey this information? How do we convey these technologies? How do we work through that whole theory of change? But at the end of the day, what they're really funding is the knowledge that must undergird that. And I think it's partly helping them to understand that, where does that knowledge fit in? And I think that sometimes they get really caught up in terms of, yeah, but how many children did you save, or how many people did you train, without understanding that you have to have knowledge and evidence that underlies the policies and programs to save those children. And you have to have the knowledge to be able to train, that's the content for these changes and for those capacity building. And and what we're talking about is that there are ways to show how you are contributing to those factors. And again, and I'll go back to the person who had the second question, is that yes, policy changes are very complicated. These social changes are different, the institutional changes are complex. But again, if you're understanding what that environment is like, and how do you sort of become part of that discussion? How do you do what you need to do that will promote the use of your knowledge, which you are ostensibly saying is addressing a key knowledge gap, then it can be done. I think that pretty much that. Yeah, I mean, and with Fred's point about the intermediate development outcomes and saying that this is really a trajectory, I think that again has 2 points. One is that what can you do in this time frame, and you can lay out your whole time frame, lay out that whole impact pathway in terms of the timeline. What part of it is in terms of what you need to do to get to your ultimate outputs, ultimate direct effect, but then what's that trajectory along that longer impact pathway to those outcomes, and what is our role as the CG? And it's perfectly fine to say that we're one part of the voice. I mean, there's a whole lot of this whole lot of research been done on how policy change happens and what the different voices are. And I think that we nevertheless bring to those discussions a particularly important voice and one that is particularly trusted. I know that that's happens when I'm dealing with the Rome-based agencies, is that they intend to look to the CG for the evidence that they need. And that's what we need to tell them. And that's the story, but we have to convince those who are looking to evaluate us and looking to fund us that that's what our major contribution is and how we will evaluate that.
The only thing I want to add is this issue about, causal inference. I think it's important to also understand that you use different logics when you're doing quantitative logic and qualitative logic, and understanding the difference amongst that entire community of people who are looking at those documents, the people evaluating, the people reading the documents, everybody should be on the same page. It's not the same. And how it is different is an important thing to think through, that with narrative data, we use the same words, but we don't often mean the same things. And that clarity is something that definitely SPIA can bring. That much is I know that it's possible. We can have a guidance document and that can be referred back. And I'm just thinking out loud here that maybe it's useful to have speakers who have thought through these issues in some depth, that we make sure that we're not confusing what causality and how causality is established in one type of research tradition and another type.
And I just want to say that as part of that, I mean, I go back to some of the questions where Narine was saying, we need to think about how we measure our specific contribution. And I would just encourage everybody to expand that. I mean, to expand that concept. In other words, that's what Monica and I are telling you about the importance of narrative and the importance of supplying evidence for that narrative. I don't think I would want to say we're going to measure in a quantitative way what the specific contribution is, but rather my terminology would be slightly different, is that to say that you are telling the story about what your contributions are to that discourse and to the policy change, and why that contribution is important. But that's what these qualitative methods that we're suggesting should be used for. And there are ways, and that's why Monica put so much emphasis in terms of the baseline, that you certainly can talk about what is the policy discourse at time zero? What information is out there right now about this topic? And that's your baseline. And then you would want to say, 2 years down the road, what have we done to contribute to that? Increasing the knowledge that needs to be out there, the innovations of technology, so that there is a narrative that talks about how you went from it wasn't talked about at all, this innovation was not being used, this technology did not exist, towards 2 years later down the road, where it is on the development agenda, the technology does exist, and what the CG's role has been to be able to bring that. And I won't go into it, but there are also ways to think about this contribution, and also in terms of, at least in terms of policy effects, and I'm sure you can do it also for agricultural technologies, in terms of what your contribution is to that outcome or to that technology or to that policy decision in a quantitative way, using quantitative analysis as well, cost-benefit analysis. And I won't go into how we do that, but it's done a lot with sort of sensitivity analysis as well. If somebody actually wants to know what's the return on their investment, that can also be done. But it really has to be part of this more complex narrative story. And I think bringing the donors on board about what really is the role of the CG and the research that we do. And I'm not sure they always understand that.
We have another question here in the auditorium. Sapling, Niels?
Yes, thank you very much. I have a more fundamental issue that it seems that as soon as qualitative methods are talked about, it immediately goes into evaluation and donors and project assessment, whereas what we've been talking about here is specific scientific questions which within the initiative framework, but they're not aimed at any donors, whoever they may be, but contributing to overall science and using scientific methods. That's why we have these partnerships or developing these partnerships. I was hoping that we could do something, and this, because of the way it comes from, is very quantitative, and that's okay. But we do know that there are various various issues within our initiatives which don't lend themselves to these methods, and so we would hope that we can find partners to also assess these issues without or before evaluating, or more specific than evaluating the whole initiative, and not worrying about donors' expectations and end of initiative outcomes at a higher level, but specific, often policy-oriented issues, because as you say, the impact pathways of most initiatives go through policy support or policy interventions or policy changes, because that's the fundamental approach of the CGIAR. And we, apart maybe from IFPRI, we have not really spent a lot of effort and time looking how all our technical results actually lead to these policy changes, although we engage all the time, but it is very ad hoc and not documented. So your specific steps and ideas, I think they were very helpful and they open up our ideas, but how this could be formed into concrete and specific studies within our initiatives for problems which are not easily accessible by quantitative methods, that would be something I would be really interested in. I think others also. Thanks very much.
We have two other hands in the chat, so and then you can respond to all three. Alan, would you like to come in?
Oh yes, thanks very much. It's really about our initiative, national policies and strategies, and you know, we're not exactly doing what's being outlined here by SPIA, but it's very much a sort of close relative of what we're trying to do, in that part of our work under Work Package 1, and this is a cross-cutting initiative, and it was set up really with the objective of supporting policy engagement, policy analysis and influencing under the one CGIAR. So under Work Package 1, we're undertaking these, what are really the baselines you mentioned there, Monica, sort of landscape analyses of policy areas and contexts in the 6 countries we're working in, one in each of the CGIAR regions. So what I think we'll do after this meeting is certainly follow up with you, because I think the rigor and method that's lacking, and it's been mentioned a few times, there's no tool for this, there's no, you know, standard or common or accepted approach across the one CGIAR for an analytical approach to all of this. That's a big gap. That's one of the big gaps. And one of the tasks we have, I think, as an initiative is to help bridge that gap, not all on our own, because it's a collective endeavor, but I think working with you will also help do that. Now, I wanted to flag Jonathan Mockshall is also on the call with our initiative, and he leads our political economy work. And as you know, donors have a huge interest in the politics of why things don't happen, you know, why their money doesn't lead to all the benefit streams and outcomes that they anticipated. So, you know, all the kind of logic of unanticipated outcomes. So that's a key part of our approach too, to sharpen the political economy tools that are being used under initiatives. And I think, again, that's something we can work with you on. So I come from a political science background, but I work with natural scientists. I'm the co-lead of MPS, and I'm with IMI. And I guess through most of my career, the best research I've ever seen or read or done has always been mixed methods research. It's qualitative and it's quantitative. It has the narrative that I've heard you mention so many times, that brings the story together and ties together the numbers and can explain some of the complexity that's been mentioned several times of social change. So I think, you know, in as far as it's possible, if we can continue to encourage that mixed methods approach as a standard across the CGIAR, I think that's really important. I'm also a Pink Floyd fan, and I do like the album Wish You Were Here. So I do think, you know, we should be spending a lot more time together doing these sorts of having these sorts of conversations, and then following them up with some really solid interaction and co-production of tools and methods. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We have one more question. Rashid, you want to come in?
Yes. I was thinking, listening to Monica, one first thing was, I understand that one possible way to proceed is to first collect the data and then have a specialist come more at the end of the study. I'm not sure most teams would feel able at this stage to collect the data on their own, with the fear of, does it need more guidance? What's the path forward if we were thinking of something of this kind? Also related to this, how do we avoid influencing the answers? Because especially when it's through interviews, eventually even if you have a baseline in the follow-up, the initial questions may be the same, but the qualitative interview also sort of cues, leads the discussion towards a certain direction. And the difference may come from the fact that in the follow-up interviews, you're trying to get more of a certain topic, and then you generate this difference, right? So this is one of the kind of concerns that one may have. And I would be worried of people trying to do this effort during 2 years, and then comes a specialist and says, well, you didn't do it the right way. So what do you see as a possible way forward to put that in practice, and for those that actually want to try some of this? Thanks.
James,
Monica, James?
James, you want to go first and then I can follow up?
I think that's a SPIA question.
Not the last one. There were other things that were talked
No,
about.
what Alan said. No,
Agree.
Yeah.
So one of the things, sorry if I cannot, it was Niels who spoke first about, having perhaps, James and I discussed whether we should have as a next step suggestion, matchmaking, but I wasn't. So one of the challenges that we are facing right now, and that may be overcome as we keep talking, is to find the right matches. So I think with more impact assessments that are done on the quantitative side, there are academics who do this, there are structures in place. So institutionally, I think it is easier. And I'm saying this with a lot of caution, because my sense is that the people who do more institutional assessments in the academic world aren't as clued in necessarily with having structures in place with students who can then take on the kind of work that you're doing, and for that whole thing to work exactly the way it does more on the econ side. That's my initial sense, which is why I hesitated even putting that. It may be a bit more of an uphill task, but I don't know if others feel the same or differently, but I just want to put it out there. We'll think about it. There are many people who do this kind of work, but they tend to be more in consultancy firms and such. So, but it's a thought. To Alan's point, and going back to John's point, yes, third Pink Floyd fan, I think we're dating ourselves, making that claim, but agreed with mixed methods. I think I'm also a big fan. One of the problems when you do not have narrative data, or when you obsess about with narrative data, when you obsess, this is my experience, sometimes reading reports, when you obsess about causality alone using narrative data, you come across pretty inane findings. It's really not helping learning. It's not helping us understand. And if we can avoid that, that would be good. To Rashid's point, I mean, yeah, we need to have a broader conversation, I feel, about, qual and quant and how to mix. I mean, ideally you want to mix, but there are some challenges there. And so it has been done very, very well in many, many instances. So we have good, and that can be put in the guidance type of document, examples of good intersection, because yeah, I mean, you can even have IE, I mean, experimental designs with good qualitative process monitoring. So if those can go hand in hand, it can yield very interesting, both from a perspective of evaluation and perspective of learning. So, that something has changed, but sometimes you struggle with understanding why or how. So that mechanism element of it can really come from mixing experimental methods with more narrative methods. But I think a broader conversation would be useful, even to come to agreement on, what methods are good. Make sure we're all on the same page with terms of the logics that we apply and so on. James, anything you want to add to that? We did tell Mina we were going to try and end early because we wanted to give the room some time to catch up, but we're fast approaching the natural end of this session. So
I'm wondering, I don't have anything else to add. I mean, I think as long as we write down what these next steps are, and follow up on those.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm going to put Ricardo on the spot and see if he has some comments about some of the comments that have been made, but also how SPIA might engage with these initiatives.
Yeah, probably Monica is what I prepared to talk on behalf of SPIA, but I think we don't have more comments here in the room, but probably we need to wrap up, and maybe Monica, I invite you for the final remarks, and also about the way forward.
Yeah, well, thank you again, James, for agreeing to be our invited speaker on this. This was very, very useful. Thank you, everybody, for participating and for all your questions. My goal with this was really to understand in as much detail and depth as possible as what are the challenges we're facing. And from there, because like James said, we were reading your proposal, reading your background notes, and it was clear that, these are being fit into a box and so on. So what are the struggles, and how do you overcome that? This was not the place to say, okay, these are our solutions, but really a place to gather these things so we can then take them and then have a discussion within SPIA. I'm not the only, my role I see is the moderator of these kinds of issues, and to even figure out who needs to hear these things so that we're not boxing. I mean, what is the point of putting ourselves in a box? So if we can think about maybe a community of practice, maybe a guidance document already people have said is useful. So we can think along those lines. And I'll end there to again thank everybody. I also learned a lot, and which was an important metric that I had for myself at the end of the session, because I'm also struggling as the person who's supposed to give guidance on what is the most useful guidance to give, given the constraints that you are facing. So this was extremely helpful. And I thank everybody's participation.
Thank you very much, Monica and James, and thanks everyone for participating and the ones who are also connected virtually. Thank you.